The flight that morning was supposed to be like any other, a smooth journey for those who could afford the comfort of first class. The air inside the terminal was thick with the smell of coffee, perfume, and polished floors. Families rushed past with their carry-ons. Business travelers tapped on their laptops, and the usual soft voice of airport announcements echoed overhead. It was the kind of setting where everyone appeared focused on their own plans, yet beneath that order, small tensions always lingered, unspoken judgments, silent hierarchies, and the invisible lines that separated one class of passenger from another. When the sun streamed through the tall glass windows, it made the planes outside gleam like silver birds ready to take flight. For most people boarding this aircraft, it was just another trip, another routine in a busy life. But hidden in that normal rhythm was a story waiting to explode, one that would leave reputations destroyed and careers shattered. The first-class cabin was pristine, wide leather seats, white cloth headrests, and attendants already moving with practiced smiles, offering champagne to early arrivals. It was the kind of place meant to feel exclusive, where people who paid the most expected not just comfort, but respect. That exclusivity carried its own silent weight, the kind that often revealed who felt they belonged and who others believed did not. Among the passengers who settled in, there were men in tailored suits, women draped in elegant scarves, and a quiet figure who carried himself with calm dignity. He wasn't dressed to impress, just a neat shirt, pressed trousers, and a watch that had clearly seen better days. But he held an air of quiet strength, as if he had weathered storms far harsher than the stares of strangers. He wasn't trying to draw attention, but sometimes people like him drew it anyway, simply because they weren't, expected to sit in spaces that others guarded like their own. At the center of this unfolding story was a man who had spent his life in the sky. A pilot with years of experience, he walked the aisle with the confidence of someone used to authority. The crispness of his uniform, the shiny wings on his chest, and the steady way he carried himself told everyone who watched that he was in charge. To him, the world worked in a certain order, rules, ranks, and roles that never blurred. But beneath that polished exterior was something harder, something less forgiving. He had grown used to being respected, even admired. Flight attendants lowered their voices when he passed. Passengers sometimes glanced at him with awe, and younger pilots envied the life he had built. Yet with that admiration came an arrogance he never tried to hide. He believed the cabin was his domain, the crew his subordinates, and the passengers, especially those in first class, were his responsibility to judge. He had never been the kind of man who simply flew planes. He liked to remind people of who was in charge. In that cabin, two very different men now shared the same space, one who held official power and one who held quiet dignity. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. The flight attendants went about their duties, passengers flipped through glossy magazines or scrolled on their phones, and the hum of the boarding process carried on. But underneath it all, there was a tension that hadn't yet revealed itself. The black man in the seat near the window barely spoke, but his presence unsettled the pilot in a way he didn't quite admit, not even to himself. He told himself it was about order, about who fit into this rarefied space and who didn't. But the truth was uglier. It was about control, about the need to remind others of their place. The pilot had lived long enough in a world where power gave him the right to speak down, to dismiss, to humiliate if he chose. And sometimes he did, without a second thought. Passengers around them had no idea what was about to unfold. To them, this was just the beginning of another long flight. But the smallest details already hinted at cracks in the fragile calm, the sidelong glances from strangers, the subtle tightening of a jaw, the shift in tone when a flight attendant answered a question. The cabin wasn't yet hostile, but it wasn't entirely welcoming either. The man by the window looked out at the runway, watching the sunlight scatter across the tarmac. He had learned a long time ago how to read a room without saying a word. He knew when someone's stare carried judgment, when a smile was hollow, when a tone was loaded with something unsaid. He felt those things here, though he said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was patience, a kind of strength the arrogant often mistook for submission. And so the stage was set. A plane ready to lift into the sky, a cabin that seemed calm but wasn't, a pilot who believed authority gave him the right to belittle, and a man who had no idea that the next few minutes would test not just his patience, but the very balance of dignity against arrogance. What looked like an ordinary flight would soon turn into a moment replayed in headlines, a story whispered in disbelief, and the end of a career built on power and pride. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and low, like a reminder of this. He whirled outside, that didn't care about the small dramas happening inside. Passengers had settled into their seats, some pulling out books, others slipping on headphones. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering drinks and adjusting luggage in overhead bins. On the surface, everything was calm, but the quiet tension between the pilot and the man by the window had already started to ripple outward. It began subtly. The pilot wasn't supposed to linger in the cabin, but he walked through first class more than once, glancing at passengers as if taking mental notes. Each time his gaze landed on the black man, and each time there was a flicker of something, disapproval, suspicion, something colder than curiosity. The man noticed it, of course, though he didn't react. He kept his shoulders straight, his expression even. But inside, there was a weight pressing on him, the familiar sting of being judged before saying a word. The first real crack in the calm came when the man asked for water before takeoff. His voice was polite, low, not demanding in the least. But when the flight attendant brought it, the pilot appeared again, almost as if he had been watching. He leaned close to the attendant, pretending to give instructions, but his words carried just enough volume for those nearby to hear. "Make sure you're careful with special requests," he said, eyes fixed not on her, but on the man in the seat. "We have to be sure passengers are actually in the right class." The words weren't direct, but they hung heavy in the air. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her smile stiff. A couple of other passengers glanced over their magazines. The man by the window kept his face still, but his hand tightened around the glass of water. He had been here before, in boardrooms, in restaurants, in waiting rooms, spaces where his presence alone was treated like a question mark. The pilot walked away as if nothing had happened, but the damage was already done. The air in the cabin shifted, no longer just polite silence, but watchful, strained. As the plane lifted into the air, the weight of unspoken words pressed harder. The man turned his gaze back to the window, watching the ground fall away. But his thoughts were restless. He remembered his father telling him when he was a boy that dignity wasn't given. It was held on to, no matter how many tried to strip it away. He had carried that lesson for years, through long nights of hard work and the constant pressure of being judged twice as harshly for half the recognition. But here, trapped in this metal box in the sky, there was no easy way to walk away. The pilot, meanwhile, sat in the cockpit with a growing sense of irritation. He told himself it wasn't personal, but deep down it was. Something about the passenger's calm, his refusal to fidget or show discomfort, gnawed at him. In the pilot's world, people deferred. They looked down when challenged, softened their tone when corrected. This man did none of that. His silence felt like defiance, and the pilot wasn't the kind of man who tolerated that for long. The tension grew in small, sharp exchanges. When dinner service began, the man asked for a vegetarian meal he had pre-ordered. The attendant checked her list and confirmed it, but the pilot appeared once more, his tone clipped. "Are you sure?" he asked her, not bothering to hide the skepticism. "We've had people mix things up before." The man finally spoke, his voice calm but steady. "I know what I ordered." Their eyes met for the first time. and in that brief moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The pilot's expression hardened, the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't just about the meal, it was about control. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. That was the thing about moments like this. Most people saw, most people knew, but silence was easier. It was safer to look away. The man ate in silence, but each bite felt heavier than the last. He could sense the eyes on him, the whispers that followed when the pilot left. His dignity was intact, but inside, frustration churned. He had spent his life proving himself in spaces that doubted him, but proving himself here, to a man so blinded by arrogance, felt like fighting shadows. As hours passed, turbulence rocked the cabin lightly, and the pilot used it as another excuse to hover. He leaned over seats, checking belts, his voice louder than necessary. He corrected the attendants with sharp words, reminding passengers to stay seated with a tone that bordered on scolding. And always, his gaze flicked back to the same man as though searching for a reason to pounce. But what no one else knew was that the pilot's arrogance wasn't born just from rank. He carried his own cracks beneath the polished surface. His marriage was falling apart, strained by years of absence and his own pride. His debts were growing, hidden beneath layers of bravado. The airline's executives had already warned him once about complaints from crew members, whispers of bullying, of passengers who felt mistreated. He told himself he was untouchable, that his record would protect him. But deep down, he felt the edges closing in. And when he saw the calm dignity of the man in first class, it felt like a mirror held up to everything he wasn't. The man, too, carried burdens invisible to those around him. He wasn't just another passenger. He was a father trying to hold together a fractured family, a professional who had fought through years of doors closing in his face, a man who knew the cost of keeping his head high when others wanted it bowed. To him, this flight wasn't just travel. It was a rare chance to breathe, to exist without proving himself. And yet, here he was again, reduced to suspicion by a man who saw only the color of his skin. The night deepened as the plane crossed dark stretches of ocean. Cabins dimmed, and many passengers tried to sleep. But the tension between the two men stayed awake, silent but alive. The pilot passed through once more, his footsteps deliberate, his smirk returning when he noticed the man still awake by the window. "You seem uncomfortable," the pilot said softly, just loud enough for the words to cut. "First class isn't always what people imagine." The man turned slowly, meeting his eyes. His voice was quiet but sharp as glass. "I know exactly what it is." For a moment there was silence, thick and heavy. The pilot's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He walked on, but the weight of that exchange lingered. The next morning, as the plane prepared to land, the tension was at its breaking point. The passengers stirred awake, attendants moved briskly to collect trays, and the cabin filled with soft light. But beneath the surface everything was coiled tight, waiting for the spark that would send it all unraveling. Both men sat in their seats, one gripping control like a lifeline, the other holding dignity like a shield. Neither could see how close they were to the moment that would change everything. The confrontation that would leave passengers stunned, the humiliation that would not end in silence, and the career that would be destroyed before the wheels even touched the ground. The descent began smoothly, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign cutting through the cabin as the plane lowered into the clouds. Passengers stirred awake, stretching, tucking away blankets, and checking their watches. The air was thick with the smell of recycled coffee and tired perfume, the murmur of people preparing to return to the ground. Yet in the first-class cabin, the tension between two men, carried silently across the hours, was about to burst open for everyone to see. The black man sat still, his seat reclined just slightly, hands resting calmly on his lap. To anyone watching, he appeared composed, but inside he felt the storm gathering. He had endured stares, thinly veiled comments, the kind of humiliation meant to slice quietly without leaving visible scars. He had faced worse in life, but there was something about being trapped in the sky, unable to walk away, that made each jab sharper. Dignity had its limits, and the pilot had pressed hard against them. The cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped back into the cabin. He wasn't supposed to be there so late in the flight, but he moved with the authority of a man who believed no rule applied to him. His eyes swept over the passengers, but everyone could see where they landed, steady and cold on the man in the window seat. "Sir!" The pilot's voice carried across the cabin, loud enough for others to hear. "I need to confirm your boarding pass." The words dropped like stones in water. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman glanced up from her tablet, brows furrowed. The flight attendant froze, tray in hand. The man in the window seat looked up slowly, his expression calm, but his heart thudding in his chest. "You want to see my pass now?" he asked, his tone even but edged with disbelief. "Yes," the pilot said, his smile sharp and mocking. "We've had mistakes before. I'd like to be sure." The humiliation was sharp, deliberate. Everyone knew that boarding passes had already been checked, not once but several times, before anyone ever sat in first class. This wasn't about procedure. It was about power. The man's hand went to his jacket pocket, slow, deliberate. His chest felt tight, heat rising to his face as every eye in the cabin turned toward him. He thought about ignoring the demand, but he knew what would follow. Accusations, escalation, maybe worse. With a steady breath, he pulled the ticket free and held it out. The pilot didn't take it right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his smirk widening as though the delay itself was a punishment. Finally, he snatched it from the man's hand and scanned it with a mocking seriousness, lips pursed, brow furrowed in fake scrutiny. "Yes," he said finally, handing it back. "Looks valid enough?" The words dripped with disdain, as though even a printed pass couldn't erase the doubt in his mind. The cabin went dead quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. The man held the pass in his hand, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling faster now. Something inside him broke. Not dignity, but patience. Years of quiet endurance, of swallowing moments like this, boiled over all at once. "Valid enough?" His voice was low, sharp, trembling not with fear, but with anger. "You humiliate me in front of everyone, and that's all you say?" The pilot straightened, his smirk faltering as the man's voice rose, firm and unshakable. Passengers sat upright, sensing the shift, eyes wide. The tension that had lingered quietly all flight long was now out in the open, raw and undeniable. "You don't belong here," the pilot snapped back, his control slipping, words sharper than he intended. "You should remember your place." Gasps echoed through the cabin. A woman put her hand to her mouth. One man whispered, "Did he just say that?" The attendants froze, eyes darting between them, unsure whether to intervene. The black man stood. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat, his full height forcing the pilot to tilt his head back. His voice carried across the cabin, steady but burning with fury. "My place," he said, each word heavy, "is wherever I have earned the right to be. I paid for this seat. I have every right to sit here. What I don't have to do is bow to your arrogance." The pilot's face flushed red, his jaw clenching. For the first time, the balance of power shifted, the calm dignity of the man overwhelming the brittle authority of the pilot. Passengers began murmuring, some pulling out phones, others nodding in quiet agreement. The pilot realized too late that this wasn't a private humiliation anymore. His words, his arrogance, his disdain, it was all witnessed, all recorded, all undeniable. Rage flashed in his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice sharp, almost desperate. "Sit down, now!" But the command fell flat, drowned out by the sound of passengers voicing their disbelief. "He has his ticket," someone said loudly. "Leave him alone." Another voice chimed in. "This is unacceptable." The man didn't sit. He stood tall, his presence filling the cabin, his voice rising one last time. "I won't be silent. Not for you. Not for anyone." The moment burned like fire, each word striking harder than any physical blow. The pilot's career built on command and control cracked in that instant. He tried to speak, to reclaim the authority slipping from his hands. But every eye in the cabin was against him now. His arrogance had turned to humiliation, his power into shame. The attendants finally moved, stepping between them, their voices calm but firm. "Captain, please," one said softly, the unease in her tone cutting deeper than anger. "It's enough." The pilot hesitated, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. For the first time, he looked less like a man in charge and more like someone cornered, exposed. He turned abruptly and stormed back toward the cockpit, the murmurs of passengers following him like a trail of condemnation. In the silence that followed, the man sat back down slowly, his heart still racing, his hands shaking just slightly. He stared out the window, the clouds thick and white, the ground drawing nearer with every passing second. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, but it had come, and it had stripped away the mask of authority the pilot wore so tightly. The cabin buzzed with quiet talk, whispers of disbelief, phones buzzing with captured footage. The humiliation meant for one man had become the downfall of another. By the time the wheels touched the ground, the crime was no longer hidden. It wasn't blood or violence that had marked this moment, but something just as scarring. A public act of humiliation, a wound dealt by words that couldn't be taken back. The pilot didn't know it yet, but his career had ended in that cabin, unraveling in front of strangers at 30,000 feet. What he thought was control had turned into chaos, and the world outside would soon see it for what it was. The wheels touched the runway with a soft jolt, and the cabin filled with the familiar hum of landing. Passengers reached for bags, checked phones, and prepared to step back into their lives. But the quiet order of routine was gone. The air in first class still carried the weight of what had happened, a heaviness that no seatbelt chime or polite announcement could erase. Everyone knew they had witnessed something bigger than a heated exchange. It was the kind of moment that lingered, replaying itself in memory, impossible to brush aside. The pilot emerged from the cockpit only once more, standing rigid by the door as passengers filed out. His jaw was set tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but the red flush on his face betrayed the storm inside him. A few people walked past without meeting his gaze, unwilling to acknowledge him. Others looked directly at him, their eyes filled with disapproval, silent judgment. Several held their phones at their sides, still recording, ensuring that his words, his arrogance, would not vanish into thin air. He felt their stares like stones against his skin, but pride kept his spine stiff. He told himself they had misunderstood, that he had simply done his job. Yet even as he tried to justify it in his mind, doubt gnawed at the edges. The black man walked out of the cabin slowly, his steps steady, his eyes forward. He didn't look at the pilot, not once. His silence was louder than any argument. Passengers moved around him, some offering quiet nods, small acknowledgements of what he had endured. One woman whispered, "I'm sorry you went through that," her voice low but sincere. He gave her a faint smile, not out of joy, but as a gesture of resilience. Inside, though, his chest felt heavy. He had spoken up, refused to bow his head, but he knew the wound would linger. Humiliation didn't vanish too. The moment the word stopped, it clung, a shadow that followed even as he left the plane. By the time both men stepped into the terminal, the story had already left the walls of the aircraft. Passengers who had recorded the confrontation uploaded clips within minutes. The videos spread quickly on Twitter, Facebook, news sites. Snippets of arrogance and defiance replayed thousands of times, stripped of context but filled with impact. The pilot's words, "You don't belong here," were played again and again, each repetition striking harder than the last. The airline issued its first statement within hours, brief and careful. "We are aware of an incident on Flight 228. We take all allegations of discrimination seriously and are reviewing the matter." But the statement did little to stop the storm. Hashtags began trending. Articles demanded accountability, and voices rose on talk shows and radio stations calling for justice. For the pilot, the fallout was immediate. Colleagues who once admired his confidence now distanced themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered that they weren't surprised. Complaints from past flights resurfaced, stories of curt remarks, of passengers feeling belittled, of attendants speaking quietly about his temper. What had once been brushed aside now carried weight. His spotless reputation, built over decades, cracked in days. At home, the toll was harsher. His wife, already worn thin from years of his absence and arrogance, watched the video online and felt something break inside her. She had lived in the shadow of his pride, enduring his dismissiveness, but now the world saw it too. Their children, teenagers old enough to understand, avoided school the next day, ashamed of the whispers they knew would follow. He tried to defend himself, insisting the video didn't tell the whole story, but his words rang hollow. Pride was no shield against the truth laid bare for millions to see. For the black man, the aftermath was both vindication and burden. Friends and strangers reached out, messages of support flooding his phone. People called him brave, dignified, and strong. But he didn't feel heroic. He felt tired. The confrontation had reopened old wounds, memories of boardrooms where his ideas were dismissed until repeated by others, of restaurants where service slowed at his table, of doors closed without explanation. He had fought through all of it, carrying himself with quiet strength, and yet here he was again, forced to prove his right to simply exist in a space he had earned. The praise felt hollow when weighed against the truth. Dignity shouldn't have to be defended in the first place. In his community, the story became a point of conversation, a mirror reflecting struggles many knew too well. Some saw hope in the way he stood tall, in the way the world rallied behind him. Others saw pain, a reminder of how deeply prejudice still cut. Churches, community centers, and dinner tables echoed with the story, parents explaining to their children what it meant, neighbors sharing their own moments of humiliation. It was never just about one man and one pilot. It was about a pattern, a wound carried across generations. The airline moved quickly once the storm refused to fade. The pilot was suspended pending investigation, but whispers inside the company said the decision had already been made. He would not return. Passengers threatened boycotts. Shareholders demanded answers, and the company's polished image cracked under the weight of public scrutiny. To protect itself, it had no choice but to cut ties with the man who had once been one of its most confident faces. He sat at home, the silence thick, replaying the moment over and over. At first, he tried to twist it in his mind, telling himself he had been misunderstood, that passengers had overreacted. But late at night, when the house was quiet and his reflection stared back at him in the dark glass of the window, the truth gnawed at him. He had humiliated a man who had done nothing but sit in his seat with dignity. He had revealed the worst parts of himself in front of strangers, and now the world knew him not as a respected captain, but as a symbol of arrogance and prejudice. The emotional toll was different for each man, but equally deep. For the black man, it was a weight added to a lifetime of carrying burdens that were never his to bear. For the pilot, it was the shattering of a life built on pride, leaving him stripped of the authority he once clung to. Both men walked away scarred, though in different ways, one carrying scars laid bare, the other carrying scars of his own making. Public opinion was unforgiving. News outlets replayed the video with analysis, and social media dissected every word, every look. Commentators debated what it meant about race, power, and privilege. Some tried to defend the pilot, suggesting stress or misunderstanding, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus demanding accountability. His fall from grace was complete, his name now synonymous with arrogance and humiliation. For the black man, Tihu, his story would follow him too. No matter how much he wanted to move on, he would always be remembered as the passenger who stood up in first class, the man who refused to bow. Some celebrated him, others pitied him, but few would let him forget, and that too was its own kind of weight. In the end, the aftermath was not just about one ruined career or one man's resilience. It was about a community forced to confront what many already knew, that dignity could be stripped in seconds, that power could be abused in silence, that justice was never as simple as it should be. The plane had landed, but the echoes of that confrontation continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the cabin where it had unfolded. In the aftermath of the crime, the lives of everyone involved were irrevocably altered. The courtroom became the final stage where years of deceit, manipulation, and hidden animosities were laid bare before the public. Legal proceedings dragged on for months, with every testimony peeling back another layer of the complex web that had led to the tragedy. Those who had orchestrated the crime faced the heaviest sentences, their reputations destroyed and their futures sealed behind prison walls. Others, whose involvement was less direct but still undeniable, received lighter punishments, though their lives too were permanently scarred. For the families of both victims and perpetrators, the justice system delivered its verdict, but no ruling could erase the grief, the shame, or the sense of betrayal that lingered in its wake. The concept of justice as it played out in court was far from comforting. For some, seeing the guilty punished brought a small measure of relief, but for others, it felt hollow. Parents and siblings of the victims found themselves caught in a cruel paradox. Justice had been served, yet their loss remained unhealed. Every guilty verdict was a reminder of what had been taken from them, a confirmation of the finality of death. Meanwhile, family members of the perpetrators carried a different burden, the weight of disgrace. They were forced to reconcile the image of the loved ones they had once trusted with the criminals who now stood condemned. Many withdrew from the community, unable to bear the stares and whispers that followed them wherever they went. For the perpetrators themselves, prison walls did not silence the echoes of what they had done. Some wrestled with genuine remorse, replaying the fateful night in their minds, haunted by regret. Others clung to denial, convinced they were victims of circumstance, manipulated by forces beyond their control. The crime had forced each of them to confront parts of themselves they had long tried to suppress: jealousy, pride, greed, or desperation. And the reality of those darker impulses left them shattered. No matter how much they tried to rationalize, the truth was inescapable. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The wider community, once bound together by familiarity and trust, was left fractured. Neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the monsters painted in the headlines. The media descended on the story with relentless intensity, turning it into a national spectacle. Every detail, each whispered argument, each financial struggle, each personal secret was picked apart and broadcast to the world. Some were outraged, demanding stricter laws and harsher punishment, while others viewed the case with a morbid fascination, dissecting motives and speculating about hidden truths. In living rooms and online forums, strangers debated morality as if it were a game, forgetting that behind the sensational story lay real lives destroyed. The societal impact of the crime was far-reaching. It forced uncomfortable questions about the systems and expectations that had played a role in its unraveling. Were there institutions that had failed to notice warning signs? Could intervention, whether from friends, family, or community leaders, have prevented the tragedy? Financial pressures and societal pride had pushed already fragile relationships toward breaking points, and the crime became a symbol of how destructive those external forces could be when left unchecked. Politicians used the case to call for reforms, while mental health advocates highlighted it as a stark example of what happens when emotional turmoil festers in silence. At its heart, the story revealed unsettling truths about morality and human behavior. It showed how fragile the line between right and wrong can become when jealousy, obsession, or desperation clouds judgment. People often imagine that crimes of this magnitude are committed by strangers, shadowy figures lurking on the outskirts of society. Yet here the true danger had come from within the intimate bonds of family and friendship. Those who should have been protectors had become destroyers, their choices driven by desires they could neither control nor admit. The crime underscored the chilling reality that under the right pressures, anyone has the capacity to justify the unjustifiable. Power dynamics were another thread woven tightly into the tragedy. Emotional manipulation, financial control, and the weight of reputation all played their part in steering events toward disaster. Those with influence used it recklessly, blind to the resentment and desperation it created. Others, too weak or afraid to resist, allowed themselves to be pulled into a spiral of destruction. It was a stark reminder that power, whether in personal relationships or within society at large, is never neutral. Left unchecked, it breeds imbalance, exploitation, and ultimately, tragedy. Even in its final resolution, the story highlighted the imperfections of justice. The guilty were punished, but punishment could not restore what had been lost. No sentence could bring back the dead or erase the nightmares of those left behind. The true justice, if such a thing exists, lies not in the cold decisions of the court, but in the hard, painful confrontation with truth. For some, that confrontation offered the beginning of healing. For others, it opened wounds that would never fully close. As time passed, the crime became more than just a headline. It became a cautionary tale. Parents told their children about it as a warning, communities used it as a reminder of vigilance, and scholars dissected it as a case study in morality, power, and the fragility of human bonds. Though the community eventually moved forward, the memory of the crime lingered like a shadow, a permanent reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. Ultimately, the story was not just about a crime, but about the human condition. It revealed how secrecy, pride, and unacknowledged desires can rot the foundations of even the closest relationships. It forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that beneath ordinary lives lie extraordinary dangers, dangers born not of strangers, but of those we love and trust the most. So justice was served in a technical sense, but true justice, restoring trust, innocence, and peace, remained forever out of reach. The legacy of the crime lived on, both as a scar and as a lesson, a sobering reminder of the complexities of human nature and the consequences of ignoring the warning signs that lead us down dark paths.